Hello everyone, it's Erin, and today I'm going to try to recreate this artwork from Disney's 1977 The Rescuers for my new villains series. And this villain is Madame Medusa with her two henchmen, Brutus and Nero. She was originally conceived by Milt Kahl. And I've got lots of gouache. I've got my round heads, flathead brush. I've got my pencil. I've got my stretchy eraser. I'm wearing fancy Madame Medusa inspired rings. I've got my water illustration board, which is taped off with washi tape to the right dimensions. I do change the dimensions a little bit. After I draw this in, I can see that they're a little off. But drawing in the composition, you'll notice that I'm barely lifting my pencil. I talked about this in the last video. That when you're drawing from reference, it makes it a little easier, at least it does for me, if I just keep my pencil on the surface almost the entire time and I look at my reference like 80% of the time. And instead of working from one section across, I kind of bounce around a little bit from one part of the drawing to another, and that helps to get the proportions. And also I'm looking at the negative space and really focusing on shape rather than what the elements I'm drawing actually are. So if I were to think of that as an arm and a hand or a crocodile's mouth, I might get a little mixed up, but instead I just focus on the shapes. And yeah, that just makes the process less intimidating. And I think it turned out pretty good, this one. I got into a nice flow. And again, those negative shapes, like you can see that shape between her two sort of chunks of hair and then down to the crocodile's nose. There's a very specific shape there. So really looking at that in the original piece helps me to get those proportions. And we're starting with the background, as always, working our way forward, and we're making brown. So this brown is a little on the orange side, but I do several coats and I adjust it as I go. But brown is typically a red, yellow, and black. You can throw in a little bit of blue. And for this one, I used a true red, but if I had used magenta, I think it would have been closer to the original background color. But anyway, as I'm working on this background, let me just talk about the setting, because the background is, it's a wood paneled wall, and it's inside, I think it's inside of an abandoned steamboat. So this movie, for the most part, takes place on the bayou in a place, I think it's called Devil's Bayou. It's in Louisiana. And this is Madame Medusa. So who is Madame Medusa? Madame Medusa, well, she's a pawn shop owner. She's like a regular lady. I don't know if I could say regular, but she's just a normal human being, no supernatural powers. She isn't a witch. She isn't, a demon. She is a nasty woman that is somewhat of a tragic figure. She's extremely greedy, and she wants the devil's eye diamond, which is the largest cut diamond in the world. Originally, pirates had stolen it and put it in this cave. So she's trying to get down into this cave. She can't because she's too big. Her crocodiles are too big. So she ends up kidnapping this little girl, Penny, from an orphanage to send her down a blowhole into the cave to get this diamond, along with a whole bunch of other diamonds and pearls. And the movie originally came out in 1977. It scared the crap out of me. And if you've seen this movie, if you saw it when you were a kid, I'm sure you can agree it's really, really scary. Putting in some of these details in the background, you can just see where it's that darker line. I'm not really worrying about things being super precise because it is sort of a painterly feeling background. This whole piece, I believe this is a cell that I'm doing. So the foreground, which is Madame Medusa and her two crocodiles, Brutus and Nero, they would have been painted on cellophane, and then the background would have been done separately. So that's how animation, traditional animation is done, is that you have all these cells which make up the frames. This film was 24 frames per second. So I don't know who actually painted this specific frame. There were a lot of animators working on this animation. There were 40. I think there were over 40, 250 people in total, including background painters. And so I don't know who the person was that did this exact painting, but Milt Kahl was the guy who conceived Madame Medusa. And so, for instance, this color that I'm doing now for her skin tone would have been, this was his idea because I saw the same skin tone in his original concept art. And I was going to do a piece of concept art, but since it's Valentine's Day tomorrow, I really wanted to do this image where she's cuddling up to one of her henchmen. And yeah, I thought it would be a good challenge to try to do a piece that comes directly from the end result, from the actual animated film instead of a piece of concept art. So the skin tone is a strange one. It's mostly magenta with a little bit of red, violet, and then white. And I did put a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of black. And then for the top coat, I added more white and the smallest hint of yellow, just to even it out a bit. It was a little bit too pink, but the skin tone's great. It goes so well with the red orange hair and the green eyes. This is a combination, that we see a lot. In fact, my mom has red hair, green eyes, and fair skin, but he really pushed it so that things are, extra pink skin, extra orange hair, and like neon green eyes. It's really a cool way to accentuate a character, to make her look a little bit crazier. But yeah, her earring was done in emerald. And now we're using yellow with a little tiny bit of that emerald, a little bit of that white pink mixture to do her eyes. So let's now talk about this character, Madame Medusa. She was, as I mentioned, a human being, but a very flawed human being, extremely greedy. She was obsessive. She was ruthless. She, at one point, Penny she's refusing to go down into this cave, which I should mention fills up with water at high tide. So she's very reasonably frightened and won't go down there. And the crocodiles are trying to get her down there, but she won't listen to them. She's not intimidated by them. So in order to get Penny to go into this cave, Madame Medusa takes her teddy bear. And that, when I was a kid, was like the worst thing she could possibly do, is hold her teddy bear for ransom. And it works. Then Penny goes down into the cave. But yeah, Madame Medusa was actually modeled after Milt Kahl's ex-wife, who had red hair. Now, did she have this color red hair? I don't think so, but it does give a little bit of this like sort of Lucille Ball, or like a vibrant red that you would see often back, I guess, in the mid-century, sort of like the 1940s and 50s. But this is, of course, pushed to the extreme, and I'm using an extreme color. This is luminous red, one of my all-time favorite colors, and it's very, very vibrant. It is a little bit on the pink side, so I added some yellow to make it more of that vibrant orange, but it also feels like clown hair, right? Like it kind of gives a bit of a Ronald McDonald vibe. And she was conceived in like the early 70s, so yeah, it feels very fitting. But his ex-wife, whose name was Phyllis Bounds, I did a little bit of research on her, and she was married 4 times, died at the age of 63. And Milt did not like his ex-wife, and it just seems like she was a real character. And yeah, so it was modeled after her. You'll notice that I just did some of her hair with that lighter skin color, or her skin tone, and that was so that I could then put the orange on top of it and the background wouldn't come through. So that's a little trick, is you can use white paint to make areas more opaque. And I've got the luminous red now mixed in with some regular red, primary red, for her dress. Her dress is just a bit darker, or a little bit more red than her hair is. And so bringing this in, and I should mention, I'm, for the most part in this piece, doing 2 or 3, sometimes 4 coats per element, and I think her dress was 3 coats. I'm using some of the red mixture from her dress mixed in with a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of black so that I can start to do the line work in her hair. And this brings me to the style of this piece and of this whole film. And a lot of films at this time, if I think about, Sword in the Stone, this, not The Secret of Nim, that's a very clean looking film. But if I think about other, illustration animation from that time period, there is this style that starts to emerge where you've got a lot of line work that is imperfect. It's sketchy. It has, I would say, quite a bit of energy to the line work, and really adds a sense of movement. It also gives a kind of a gritty feel that is, I think, really evocative of the 1970s. Like films around that time, this came out in 1977, were quite dark and gritty. And that was, I guess, a sign of the times, but this movie really does embody that same kind of gritty, dark feeling. I would say that this is the darkest of the Disney animated movies. But this line work, so for her hair, again, I'm using this darker red now with a little bit more black in it. And then I'll go over it again at the end with an even darker red. But the line work changes color. You've got, for some elements, the line work is just the same hue as the element, only darker. It becomes a shade of that hue. Whereas for other elements, like the crocodiles, the line work is done in black. So there is this interesting combination of using both color and black for line work. And the line work is often quite broken up. It's not these solid, complete lines that are outlining things. And again, that adds to that sense of sort of movement and that imperfection, which actually overall I feel like it gives it a more realistic feel in some ways. It's interesting. We're working on the alligators now. Are they crocodile? No, they're crocodiles. Are they crocodile? Uh-oh. I can't remember. What have I been saying? I know I looked this up just to make sure that they are. I'm looking at Disney Wikipedia right now. And I did see earlier where it was, but I'm not going to waste the time. I'm not going to waste time trying to find this. But the color that I'm doing for either Brutus or Nero, I'm not sure. They are crocodiles, but I'm using yellow and black mixed together to make what I usually call Exorcist green. So if you've seen The Exorcist, you know what I'm talking about, this sort of pea soup green. And yellow and black. I talk about this in many videos, but it makes a lovely Exorcist green because black has a blue bias. So when you mix yellow in with it, you get a green. And you can add a little bit of blue to give it more saturation, to make it a little more on the green side than the yellow side, which is what I do for the upper darker part of the crocodile's face and body. But for now, I'm just doing that bottom part, and that bottom part took 4 coats. You want to wait till each coat dries completely. If you try to go over it when it's still wet, you run the risk of picking up paint underneath. So let it dry completely. I have been using a blow dryer lately. It's working great. And you don't want to keep trying to smooth out your lines. That's the other thing. I notice students doing that. I know that I often am tempted to do that, where you see a streak, or you see an area where there's a little bit of a buildup of the gouache, and the temptation is to smooth that out, but don't smooth it out. Let it dry, and then when you do your next coat, usually it'll look smoother, and then that's when you focus on consistency for the gouache. You feel the gouache. Does it feel like it's melted ice cream? Does it feel smooth and creamy without being too thick so that it won't get caught on your surface? Is it smooth to paint? Maybe do a little swatch first to check it out. And once you get it to that consistency and you do a few coats, typically by the last coat, once it dries, things will be smooth and opaque and have that lovely matte sort of velvety finish. And you'll also see that I'm using a number 6 brush as always, because it holds a lot of paint but has a nice fine tip, so that I can get into these little areas like in between her fingers. And as long as you're holding your brush super, super close to the bristles, you'll have a lot more control, so you can get in there and make a nice clean shape. So back to Madame Medusa, just a few more things. So I mentioned that she was modeled after Phyllis Bounds, who was Milt Kahl's ex-wife. Also, she was Walt Disney's either sister-in-law or niece-in-law. I've read 2 different accounts or 2 pieces of information. I don't know which one's correct. But she was voiced by an actress named Geraldine Page, who had been an Oscar contender, a great actress who really did an amazing vocal performance. I think one of the things about Madame Medusa that is so effective and also pretty freaky is the way she moves. She moves with a lot of energy. She has this really emotional sort of over the top way of moving, but it feels extremely realistic. I know they used live action video for a lot of their reference, but Milt Kahl did not. He didn't use live action. He would actually move himself for every drawing that he did. He would do the pose. He would really embody it. And for her, it was said that he focused on her center of gravity. You know, she's kind of a bottom heavy lady, and a lot of her movements sort of move around her midsection, her hips. And yeah, I mean, I can kind of relate to that, but excellent vocal performance, amazing movement, really cool character design, you know, with what I was mentioning before, the color palette, right? Those green eyes and her orange red hair, her pinkish skin, her dress. And I love that she's kind of sloppy and floppy, and she's totally like free boobin, no bra, you know, she's got these socks that are kind of like rolled down and fall. She's got this, I don't know, this sort of like unabashed confidence. And yeah, she's awful, but she's also a really fun character. And she was really fun to paint too, because I got to use luminous red. I'm mixing up white with a little bit of yellow to make the whites of her eyes, which are not pure white. Usually when you're painting the whites of eyes, you don't use straight up white. You will use like a creamy mixture, like something that's more cream or a little bit more taupe. But for her character, a little bit of yellow was really effective. And then for the crocodile's eyes, I just add more yellow because his eyes are quite obviously yellow. A nice trick is adding some white to yellow so that the yellow will be more opaque, because traditionally it's very transparent, the pigment. And the other trick to do with white and yellow paint is that if you want a white to be brighter, if you add a little bit of Naples yellow, it will actually brighten up your white. So if you're painting the moon, that's a nice trick, is use a tiny bit of yellow. Oh, her lips. Oh, I love her mouth. It's so expressive, and the way it's like kind of a Cupid's bow mouth, but then it goes up and then curls down just a little bit. So it's kind of that snarl. And it really reminds me of Ursula from The Little Mermaid. And in a lot of ways, Madame Medusa passed on traits to Ursula. You know, the hair is very similar, that short kind of hair that has a lot of movement. You know, you've got the curled mouth, the lips, and the purple eyeshadow, which I'll be doing soon. And that kind of unhinged, like diva, like almost like a washed up diva vibe going on. And they both have two henchmen that are aquatic. So I just thought of that, actually, that Madame Medusa has the crocodiles, whereas Ursula, I believe they're eels. They're like electric eels or Monterey eels. Oh, the teeth. So here's an example of where I mixed in a small amount of yellow with the white so that they would stand out more than if it was just straight up white. And this tooth, I made it a little bit too fat. He's got a fat tooth. So the fix for that is just making some of the other teeth a little fatter too, so that it doesn't stick out like a sore tooth. Or I was actually going to say a sore thumb, but that worked even better, sore tooth. Yeah, so background, chair color now, we're mixing up a purple. And here's a trick, this is a good tip, is purple, if you use red, primary red, and you use, you know, like a cyan blue, you will get more of a brown purple. It will not be a bright, vibrant purple. To get a really nice, vibrant purple or a mauve, you want to use a cool red like magenta, and then a warm blue, which would be ultramarine. So mixing ultramarine and magenta will give you a nice purple. If you can get your hands on some red violet and mix that in with some ultramarine blue, you get a really great, vibrant purple. But yeah, purple's a tough one. I recommend making, you know, a bunch of swatches and sort of create your own swatch tables so that you can, I can't remember what they're called right now. There is a technical term for them, and then just mixing up a bunch of different reds and blues together to see what happens. This background chair has a little bit of modeling in it, which means there's darker areas and then lighter areas blending in together. So I made a few different purples beforehand so that I would be ready to do that while it was still wet. So the one time you do want to go wet on wet with gouache is when you want to do a little bit of blending or create a gradient. And so it's very subtle, that background purple, the different purples in it. I could have pushed that a little bit more, but yeah, you just wet on wet, have your different hues ready, your shades and tints. And then I have that gray part as well. And it really comes together once I do the line work. That chair, right now it just kind of looks like a blob, but once the line work comes in, it definitely looks more like a chair. And speaking of line work, here we go. We're bringing some line work into the crocodile's squished up cute face. And I started with a very, very dark greeny blue, thinking that might work, but then as I was looking back at the original piece, you can see that it is a black outline or a black line work for the crocodiles. So I do go over it again with black. And for line work, a couple of tips. So number one is a number 6 brush is perfect because the more pressure you apply to the brush, the thicker the line. And these lines are definitely not uniform. They're not all the same line weight. They go from thick to thin, which is called a calligraphic line. And there's a lot of motion to them. There's movement and energy. They're not stiff, precise lines. So a number 6 allows you to have that variation of line weight, but it also holds a lot of paint, so you don't have to go back and reload your brush. And the reason that's a problem is because that will break up your flow. You really do get into kind of a flow state when you're doing line work, and there's a rhythm to it. So that's my favorite thing about doing line work is this sort of rhythm that you get into, and it really does feel like painting as opposed to just replicating. So this is where I enjoy the whole process, but this is the part that I really love is doing this line work. And this is where I'm a little bit freer. I'm not looking at the reference the same as much anyway. And I'm just sort of getting into that flow. However, right here coming up, whoops, I don't know why she has a wiggly arm. I'm not sure what happened there, but I was definitely feeling that rhythm, and I just like loosened up a bit too much. But I don't hate it. But it does show you, that I was in that kind of headspace where everything was like, oh, wavy and fun and energetic. And he does look happy, doesn't he? In my mind, the crocodile's really enjoying the snuggle that he's getting. There does feel like there's some genuine tenderness happening in this moment. I mean, she's not very nice to these two crocodiles. And then there's also Mr. Snoops, who's her lackey, like her human counterpart, who's a bit of a wimp. And she really bullies him. But she seems to have true affection for her crocodiles. Oh, Madam Medusa, you strange, twisted woman. And now we're going to move on in a minute here to the line work on her face, which is, admittedly a little more difficult, a little more intimidating. And the trick, as always, is just really focusing on shape. And here is where I'm staring at the reference to get that nose shape, because these shapes feel sort of odd, but once they come together, you're like, oh yeah, that is definitely a nose. And she has this incredibly pointy, it kind of reminds me of like a Michael Jackson after all the surgeries, but there's like this extreme point to her nose, which I believe there's a few Disney villains that have these like extremely pointy noses. I think the eyelashes turned out well. The pupils and irises, I don't love the way I outline them. That's okay. It's not terrible. And then, of course, the sort of lines under her eyes. She does look, did I mention yet that she kind of has like a haggard look, which I can relate to. Like if I don't sleep very well or if I stay up late with friends and I've had maybe a glass of wine and I've been laughing all night, I'll go look in the mirror and I'll have like, smudged mascara and my hair will be a little bit wild and just have this slightly unhinged sort of haggard look, which she definitely embodies. Madame Medusa has seen a lot. She's been through a lot, I think. I have a feeling. Why else would she be such a greedy biatch? I'm going to just imagine that she's had a tragic past. Okay, I think we're done. Yay, we can take the tape off and she's looking good. If there's a villain that you'd like me to replicate, please let me know in the comments below. And a little boop for her nose. Boopy doop. And thanks so much for watching. Go check out The Rescuers and I'll see you all soon. Bye.